She called herself a horse lover, but when financial trouble hit, Sarah made a decision that shocked her entire community. She threw her beloved horse out onto the street without a second thought. But what she didn't know was that this single act of cruelty would come back to haunt her in ways she never imagined. And the ending? It will leave you absolutely speechless. If you believe in karma and second chances, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let's see how Sarah's story unfolds together. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling ranch outside Austin, Texas, where Sarah Mitchell had built what she thought was her perfect life. At 42 years old, she had everything a woman could want: a beautiful property with white fences, a successful equestrian business, and a reputation as one of the most dedicated horse lovers in the entire county. People would drive by her ranch and admire the way she cared for her animals, the way she groomed them, the way she seemed to have an almost magical connection with every creature on her land. But Sarah harbored a secret that would soon unravel everything she had carefully constructed. For the past 3 years, her finances had been crumbling beneath the surface while she maintained the facade of success. The equestrian business that once thrived had slowly declined as younger competitors entered the market with flashier facilities and lower prices. Her savings had dwindled from 6 figures to barely enough to cover 2 months of expenses. The bank had begun sending letters about her mortgage, and the veterinary bills for her horses were piling up faster than she could pay them. Sarah had always prided herself on being independent, on never asking for help, and on handling her problems alone. But this time, the problems were too big to hide. One particular horse on her ranch was a magnificent Arabian named Midnight. Sarah had owned Midnight for 8 years, since the horse was just a young foal. She had raised him from birth, trained him herself, and spent countless hours grooming his black coat until it shone like polished obsidian. Midnight was worth approximately $30,000 on the open market, and he was the crown jewel of her collection. But as Sarah's financial situation deteriorated, she began to see Midnight not as a beloved companion, but as a liability. The horse required premium feed, regular veterinary care, and specialized training, all of which cost money she simply did not have. One evening, as Sarah sat in her study surrounded by unpaid bills and overdue notices, she made a decision that would haunt her forever. She would get rid of Midnight, not by selling him, which would have been the ethical choice, but by simply throwing him out onto the street, hoping someone else would take responsibility for him. She convinced herself that this was not cruelty, but pragmatism, that the horse would be better off somewhere else, that someone would surely find him and care for him. The next morning, Sarah led Midnight out to the main road that bordered her property. She removed his halter and bridle, gave him a sharp slap on the rump, and watched as the confused horse trotted down the asphalt. Her heart felt like stone in her chest, but she told herself she was doing what needed to be done. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of her phone ringing incessantly. It was Sheriff Tom Coleman, a man she had known for nearly 20 years. His voice was stern, professional, and carried an edge of disappointment that cut deeper than anger ever could. A horse matching Midnight's description had been found on the highway near the county line, confused and frightened, nearly causing a major accident when a truck swerved to avoid hitting him. The horse had been taken to the county animal shelter, and Sarah's name was found on his microchip registration. The sheriff informed her that abandoning an animal was a crime in Texas, punishable by fines up to $4,500 and potential jail time. Sarah's face went pale as she listened to the words, her carefully constructed world crumbling faster than she could process. She tried to explain her financial difficulties, her mounting debts, her desperation, but the sheriff would hear none of it. He told her that if she truly loved horses as she claimed, there were other options available to her. She could have contacted the Texas Equine Rescue Foundation. She could have reached out to local horse sanctuaries. She could have posted about Midnight on social media and found him a new home with someone capable of caring for him. Instead, she had chosen the path of least resistance, and now she would face the consequences. Within hours, the story began spreading through the small community. Social media exploded with the news of Sarah's betrayal. The woman who had built her reputation on loving horses had abandoned one of the most beautiful animals the county had ever seen. Local news stations picked up the story. And soon Sarah's name and face were broadcast across the entire state. Strangers called her home, leaving voicemails filled with anger and disgust. People she had considered friends stopped answering her calls. The equestrian community, which had once celebrated her, now ostracized her completely. Business inquiries that had once filled her inbox dried up entirely. Parents who had been considering boarding their horses at her ranch withdrew their animals immediately. Within 2 weeks, Sarah had lost every single client she had built over the past 15 years. Her reputation, which had taken a decade and a half to construct, had been obliterated in 48 hours. The financial pressure that had driven her to abandon Midnight now intensified exponentially. She was facing criminal charges, potential jail time, thousands of dollars in fines, and a business that was now completely non-existent. Sarah found herself sitting alone in her house every evening, staring at the empty stables where her horses used to live, wondering how her life had spiraled so completely out of control. Midnight stood in the shelter's paddock, his magnificent black coat now matted and dull from days on the road. The shelter staff had cared for him as best they could, but the horse carried the weight of abandonment in his eyes. It was then that Marcus Webb, a retired veterinarian from Dallas, saw Midnight's photo on the shelter's social media page. Marcus had spent 45 years treating horses, and he had developed an almost supernatural ability to see the potential in broken animals. He drove to the shelter that same afternoon and spent 3 hours simply standing near Midnight, speaking to him in soft tones, letting the horse know that he was safe. Something shifted in that moment. Marcus decided he would adopt Midnight, not as a possession, but as a companion for his remaining years. He began documenting Midnight's recovery on social media, posting weekly updates showing the horse's gradual transformation. The matted coat became glossy again. The dull eyes regained their spark. The frightened movements became confident strides. Within 3 months, Midnight was unrecognizable from the abandoned horse that had been found on the highway. Marcus's posts garnered thousands of followers, and the story of Midnight's redemption began spreading across the internet once more. But this time, it was a story of hope rather than cruelty. News outlets that had previously condemned Sarah now featured Marcus and Midnight as an example of second chances and the power of compassion. The narrative had completely reversed. Sarah watched from her isolation as the world celebrated Midnight's recovery with Marcus. She saw the comments, the likes, the shares, all celebrating a horse that she had thrown away like garbage. The weight of her actions finally crashed down upon her with full force. She realized that her attempt to solve her problems by abandoning Midnight had only multiplied them exponentially. She had lost her business, her reputation, her community, and worst of all, she had betrayed the trust of an animal that had loved her unconditionally. Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would face her consequences head-on and work to rebuild herself from nothing. She hired a criminal defense attorney and prepared to accept responsibility for her actions. She reached out to the Texas Equine Rescue Foundation and volunteered to work with them for free, dedicating herself to helping other horses in crisis. She began writing letters to people she had hurt, not asking for forgiveness, but simply acknowledging the pain she had caused. Slowly, painstakingly, Sarah began the long journey of redemption. Her criminal case was eventually resolved with community service, probation, and substantial fines. But more importantly, she had found a new purpose. She worked at the Rescue Foundation for 2 years, helping to rehabilitate abused and abandoned horses. She discovered that her skills with horses had never left her, and more importantly, she discovered that genuine compassion was far more powerful than the selfish fear that had driven her to abandon Midnight. One day, while working at the foundation, Sarah received a visitor. It was Marcus Webb, and he had brought Midnight with him. Marcus explained that he had been following Sarah's work at the foundation and believed that she deserved a chance to see how far Midnight had come. Sarah wept as she stood before the horse she had once thrown away, now healthy and vibrant and loved. Midnight walked over to her and nuzzled her shoulder as if forgiving her for everything. In that moment, Sarah understood that redemption was possible, that people could change, and that sometimes the darkest moments in our lives can become the catalysts for the most profound transformations. She had lost everything, but in losing everything, she had finally found herself.